having lost everything because of her husband and his mistress, a mother of three, rescued a homeless man. And in his rags, she found a key to a storage locker. Michelle Ryan walked slowly along the riverside, feeling utterly betrayed by everyone, especially by Sean, who had left her with nothing after the divorce. She had placed her hopes on the court, but it had offered her nothing. In fact, it had taken the last shred of her security away. There is no basis for dividing the assets, the judge's words echoed in her mind. It's clearly stated in the prenuptial agreement. These legal terms felt like a foreign language to Michelle. The lawyer she'd hastily hired had been of little help. His attempts to defend her rights were no match for the cool, calculated readiness of her husband and his new lover, Judy Stewart. And this, despite the fact that Michelle was raising 3 adopted children and working as a bus driver. A paradox, no doubt. Sean's lawyer had used this very fact against her. The children, he argued, were adopted from an orphanage, all 3 siblings, and had no biological connection to his client. So, what grounds were there for alimony? Trying to push the unpleasant memories away, Michelle thought about her sons. A soft smile touched her lips. Imagine 3 7-year-old boys, already in school, fiercely loyal to one another, and even helping her and their sick grandmother. Happiness, pure and simple. How could anyone not love children? A light rain began to fall, and the waves of the mighty river seemed to battle each other, whispering the latest news. Michelle took a few more steps when she heard an odd noise coming from the shore. It sounded vaguely like a sob or maybe a groan. Could someone have abandoned a puppy? Or maybe a kitten, she wondered, taking a few steps closer. Hey, are you there? Do you need help? No answer. She approached the riverbank cautiously. Lying on the grass, near the water, was a young man. He was dressed in torn, soaking wet clothes, his face pale, his lips blue. He looked every bit the part of a vagrant. The man groaned, tried to move, but failed, then slipped back into unconsciousness. Easy, easy, not too fast, Michelle murmured, quickly assessing him. Please, just hold on. I'll help. Michelle acted swiftly and confidently, just as she had learned in her first aid courses. A skill she knew could be essential. Anything could happen on the bus, and such knowledge would never be wasted. She tilted the stranger's head back sharply and opened his mouth, then turned him on his side to prevent him from choking. But the man didn't make a sound. Tears filled her eyes. Was she really going to face something like this again? Just as when the biological mother of her children had passed away on Michelle's bus? Don't go, do you hear me? Breathe. Come on, she cried out in desperation, slapping his back out of sheer helplessness. Only the river's soft waves responded to her. Then she placed her hand on his chest and felt it begin to move, slowly. In the same moment, the man began to cough, and water streamed from his mouth. He opened his eyes, looking at his rescuer with confusion and fear. Where am I? The man whispered hoarsely. You're safe. You almost drowned. Lucky I found you, Michelle replied, helping him sit up. Thank you, the stranger said weakly, offering a small, grateful smile that lingered in his tired eyes. Come with me. I'll help you out. My house is nearby. Well, technically, it's my mom's, but she's wonderful, Michelle said reassuringly. The man gave a strained smile and, leaning on her shoulder, followed her away from the riverbank. They walked in silence. Perhaps he was still gathering his strength, or maybe Michelle was lost in the turmoil of her own recent heartbreak. She hadn't felt this shattered in a long time. Sean's lawyer, Stephen Daniels, had even threatened her with losing her parental rights if she dared to pursue alimony. Knowing the kind of scoundrel Sean had hired, Michelle hadn't fought back. She knew Daniels was capable of anything. It felt deeply unfair. After all, they had bought their apartment with shared funds, thrilled to have found such a perfect place. Her mother had saved up for years, and her late grandmother Glenda had also helped. But, as often happens, Michelle hadn't been able to prove her right to the property. Sean had prepared meticulously for the court case, hiring expensive lawyers and planning every detail. But Michelle had hardly had time to prepare, with all her free hours devoted to caring for her ailing mother. 5 years earlier, her mom, Virginia Taylor, had started showing symptoms of a rare illness. Unfortunately, an initial misdiagnosis led to ineffective treatment. Michelle found herself torn between work and home, with no support from Sean, who'd always seen her mother as a freeloader, sponging off her daughter. "He played me so well, I didn't see it coming," Michelle thought with a pang. The court's decision against her share in the property had drawn applause from Sean and his new partner, Judy. Even her mother-in-law, Cynthia, had been saddened by her son's actions, knowing the family was irreparably broken. Cynthia had never been overly affectionate toward Michelle, but she'd maintained a kind of neutral respect, never taking sides and allowing them to work things out on their own. After the trial, Cynthia had silently embraced Michelle, expressing what words couldn't. Lost in these thoughts, Michelle barely noticed when they arrived at her modest 5-story building. Her hand trembled as she pulled the keys from her coat pocket. "My name's Billy Gibson," murmured the man as they reached the entrance. "Thank you again. Maybe I shouldn't come up, it feels wrong somehow." Michelle smiled warmly, introducing herself and insisting he come up to dry off and at least have some tea. Billy nodded politely and followed her, stumbling a bit on the dark stairs as they climbed up. The door creaked softly as Michelle opened it, and she was immediately greeted by the cheerful chaos and the smell of fried potatoes. 3 little miracles, Arthur, David, and Ralph, surrounded her in an instant, hugging her legs and chattering away nonstop. "Mama," they shouted, talking over each other. "We missed you so much. My sweethearts." "I missed you too," Michelle whispered, hugging them close. "How's Grandma?" "Grandma Virginia didn't feel well today," Arthur, the most thoughtful of the 3, said seriously. "She had a headache and kept coughing." "Oh, poor Mom," Michelle sighed. "We'll check on her soon." Turning around, she nodded to Billy, inviting him to follow her into the cozy but cluttered apartment. Ralph, the most energetic of the boys, pointed at Billy with wide eyes. "Mama, who's that?" "This is Billy," Michelle replied, glancing at the man who stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, looking like he'd wandered into a different world. "He caught a bad cold and needs some help." "Can I help him?" asked David, always eager for an adventure. "Of course, buddy." Michelle smiled. "But first, let's get everyone fed." "Yay!" Dinner, the boys cheered, their excitement filling the room. Billy couldn't help but smile as he watched them. Michelle moved swiftly through the kitchen, as quick and coordinated as a bee, setting the table with well-practiced ease. The comforting aroma of chicken soup she'd made earlier, along with the fried potatoes, filled the kitchen, promising a warm, satisfying meal. "Billy, please have a seat," Michelle said, gesturing to the table. "Boys, come to the table." The 3 little rascals rushed into the kitchen, each sneaking curious glances at Billy, who still seemed stunned, as if caught in a spell. "Mom, can I ask a question?" Arthur began quietly. "Of course," Michelle replied with a warm smile. "Is Billy going to stay with us now?" "Well, I'm not sure," she said, her smile softening. "Maybe he'll stay for a couple of days until he feels better." "That's awesome. Then maybe Billy can fix my bike?" Arthur asked hopefully. "And my roller skates?" David chimed in eagerly. "And my slingshot," Ralph added, unable to resist. All right, little rascals, I give up." "Not all at once. Let's go ahead and have dinner," Michelle replied with a smile. The children eagerly started eating, filling the kitchen with laughter and chatter. She watched them, feeling a slight relief. At least something in her life remained unchanged. The warm, cozy, noisy atmosphere of a family dinner. Finally, after feeding her hungry sons, Michelle quietly slipped out of the kitchen, trying not to disturb the fragile peace. Her heart clenched with worry as she approached her mother's room. "Mama, how are you feeling?" Michelle asked gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. Virginia lay there, staring into space. Her fragile, illness-ravaged body seemed barely able to hold her spirit. "Michelle, my dear," she whispered in a weak, raspy voice. "I feel so awful. These medicines, they just aren't helping." "Mama, don't talk like that," Michelle said, placing her hand on her mother's cheek. "We'll do everything we can to make you feel better." "No, I can feel it. My strength is slipping away," Virginia murmured, her voice breaking. "What will happen to you and the boys when I'm gone?" "Please don't think about that," Michelle whispered, taking her hands. "We'll make it through together, remember? We'll always be together." "But that court, Sean, he took everything from you, the apartment, your family life. And who was that man you brought here?" "I heard a voice," Virginia said, tears spilling down her sunken cheeks. "Please, don't cry." Michelle embraced her, feeling her own eyes well up. "We'll find a way, we have to, for the boys. They're our future. And Billy. I saved him. He almost drowned in the river. I managed to revive him." "Well, if you think so, dear. But how will we manage?" Virginia sobbed, clutching her daughter's hand tightly. "We have nothing left but this apartment." Michelle stayed silent, stroking her mother's hair, trying to convey some of her own strength and hope. Her heart was breaking from the pain and hopelessness of their situation. But Michelle couldn't allow herself to despair. She, too, was a mother, the family's anchor, and she had to be strong for all of them. As for Sean, God would judge him. He'd abandoned her and seemed more than happy to do it. The children used to be a priority when there were benefits involved, but now that he'd found a wealthy girlfriend, nothing else seemed to matter. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, the boys were chattering away to Billy like a flock of sparrows, eagerly sharing stories about school. Arthur proudly mentioned getting a top grade in math, and David shared how he'd finally learned to tie his shoelaces. Ralph, silent but curious, watched the guest, occasionally offering him a spoonful of soup or a pickled cucumber from their grandmother's pantry. Billy, feeling a bit shy, listened to their chatter with a warm smile. He was touched by the boys' cheerfulness, which seemed to help them overcome any hardship. "Thank you so much for the dinner," Billy said when the plates were empty. "You're a wonderful cook." "Yes, our mom is a real magician in the kitchen," Arthur announced proudly. "She can make a feast out of nothing." Billy smiled. "And you're something else," he joked to David. "So, you finally learned to tie your shoelaces. I still don't know how to handle those things. Want me to teach you?" David offered, already imagining himself as a skilled teacher. "Definitely." Billy nodded. After dinner, once the kids had finally settled down and went off to their room, Billy turned to Michelle and asked, "Maybe I could set up on the balcony. I'd feel more comfortable there. I love watching the sunrise. And I like to sketch, too." "The balcony?" Michelle frowned. "But it's cold and damp out there." "Don't worry," Billy reassured her. "I don't mind the cold." She nodded, and while he headed for the bathroom, she gathered his soaked rags, still unsure what to do with them, wash them or simply toss them. In one barely noticeable pocket, she found a tiny, shiny key with an engraved number, 413. Michelle's heart gave an uneasy jolt. She recognized it as the kind of key used for storage lockers. What would he need this for, she wondered. After a moment's thought, she handed Billy one of Sean's old shirts and pants. "Here, take these. Change into something dry. I'll wash your clothes, no need to return them. Consider it a free service," she said with a smile. Billy accepted the clothes, grateful and visibly shy. Michelle left the key on the windowsill, in plain view, then went to the balcony, where she laid out an old mattress on the floor and gave him a blanket. Billy carefully avoided any questions about how he ended up by the river or why he decided to go for a swim in the middle of autumn. After showing him around, Michelle checked the kids' homework and headed to her room. She needed rest before her shift tomorrow, her work demanded full concentration, and her route was especially challenging. Lying in bed, Michelle's body ached with exhaustion, and her mind swirled with anxious thoughts. It had been a particularly tough day. Driving a bus wasn't an easy job. Each day felt like a marathon, requiring calm and a clear mind. And there were endless reasons for irritation: late passengers, someone losing their ticket, another talking loudly on the phone, someone else refusing to give up their seat to an elderly person. And then, there are days that turn everything upside down, Michelle thought, remembering the most terrifying yet brightest day of her life. From early that morning, snow had been falling in thick flakes, covering everything in a white veil. City services were overwhelmed by the storm, and traffic jams and snowdrifts appeared everywhere. Michelle gripped the steering wheel tightly, struggling to keep control of the bus. Inside, the air was chilly, and outside, nothing but a white haze could be seen. The bus crawled along the snow-covered highway on an intercity route. Suddenly, muffled groans broke the silence inside the chilly bus. A young woman with a weary face clutched her stomach, grimacing in pain. "Oh God, she's giving birth," someone shouted. "Call an ambulance, quick." Michelle felt her stomach twist. She had never faced anything like this before. "What do I do?" shot through her mind. In an instant, she grabbed her radio and tried to contact the dispatcher, but all she heard was static. The connection was lost. Even now, 7 years later, Michelle remembered the surge of panic that shot through her body. But at that moment, she knew she had to act. "Men, help me," she commanded in a steady voice, despite her trembling hands. "Is there anyone here who knows anything about medicine?" The young mother-to-be, a girl with fear-filled eyes, moaned in pain. Ignoring every rule and instruction, Michelle acted on instinct, comforting the stranger as if she were an experienced midwife. "Don't be afraid," she whispered. "Hold on, we'll get through this." The ride was turning into a nightmare. Outside, the snowstorm intensified, and the roads became impassable. Emergency services couldn't reach the bus trapped in the snow. Some passengers were crying, others muttered prayers under their breath. A few shared warm water from their thermoses and passed around clean towels. "Dear God, what do I do next?" Michelle thought desperately, looking at the woman on the verge of passing out. A sense of panic was building in the bus. People were grumbling, jostling, and some were shouting, calling the situation a mess. Michelle took a deep breath and kept trying to calm the woman. "It will be all right, I'm here with you," she repeated, holding her hand. No one believed Michelle could actually deliver a baby on a bus stuck in a blizzard. But somehow, it happened. Later, no one could explain how Michelle managed the impossible. There, under the gaze of terrified passengers, Michelle delivered the first birth of her life. Triplets, she finally cried, overwhelmed with tears. "Oh my God, 3 boys." Not noticing the tears streaming down her face, Michelle cut the umbilical cords and wrapped the babies in jackets that the passengers had handed over. 3 little ones. "A miracle in the middle of the storm," someone whispered. A round of applause rose in the cabin in honor of the day's hero, but the joy was short-lived. The young mother had lost too much blood, and despite their efforts, she took her last breath. A quick-thinking passenger gently covered her with a coat. The celebration shifted to a profound sense of loss. "Thank God the babies are alive," Michelle thought, gazing at the tiny bundles wrapped in passengers' coats. Such beautiful little ones. But what will happen to them now? Even then, Michelle knew she couldn't leave them as orphans. She just couldn't. Who could tell her they weren't hers? After all, they were only minutes old. Michelle had a gut feeling that the mother had no family. Why else would she board that bus, alone, on the verge of giving birth, wearing only a thin jacket and lacking enough for the fare? It was only thanks to a fellow passenger that she was able to board. Later, Michelle's suspicions were confirmed. The deceased mother's name was Lori Sutton. She'd lost her parents at a young age and grew up in an orphanage. Lori ran away with her fiancé a month before her graduation. The father of her babies, Randy Harris, had quickly found a job as he'd completed a driving course and received his license 6 months earlier. As a former orphan himself, Randy worked endless hours for a small wage, taking on extra shifts whenever possible. But it was unsustainable, and one day Randy fell asleep at the wheel and crashed off a bridge into the river. Later, rescuers reported that he died with his hands still gripping the steering wheel. Lori was at home waiting, holding a positive pregnancy test, and even had a small cake ready to celebrate, made from a recipe she'd learned in the orphanage, with biscuits, butter, and condensed milk. But that day, her fiancé never came home. Due to her frail health, doctors had advised Lori to be admitted to the maternity ward for monitoring from her 7th month of pregnancy. But Lori had her own plans, carrying her pregnancy on her own, right until the end. On that fateful day, she made an unwise choice, heading to Randy's grave in such terrible weather. Police and emergency responders struggled to understand why she'd visited his grave on that particular day. The truth was only discovered that spring, by which time Michelle had already been granted guardianship of the babies. It turned out that the day Lori passed away was Randy's 20th birthday, and her visit was her way of giving him a final gift. Struggling to hold back her tears, Michelle whispered. Despite the fact that an official medical review found no fault in her actions, Michelle still felt responsible for Lori's death. After all, she delivered the babies herself, which meant the entire burden fell on her. The first responder, an EMT who broke through the snow to reach the bus, was astonished by Michelle's courage and selflessness. He explained that even trained obstetricians might struggle to deliver a baby under such challenging conditions without the support of nurses and proper equipment. Michelle wrestled with this experience for a long time. She even saw a therapist for 6 months, but eventually found peace with it all. Perhaps it had been fate's plan for her to become a mother that day, taking in the babies of a lost woman. Arthur, David, Ralph, she whispered their names while lying in bed, my boys. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but this time they were from love, not sorrow. She had given them a family and a home. They were the most precious part of her life. Suddenly, like scenes from an old film, other memories appeared, brighter and filled with warmth. It was spring. The sun, still gentle, warmed the steaming asphalt. The air was fresh, filled with the scent of blooming lilacs. Michelle was happily returning to the station after her evening route. The bus was empty, and she enjoyed the quiet in the cabin, relishing the peace. Suddenly, in the rearview mirror, Michelle spotted a man standing on the roadside, looking lost beside his broken-down car. Poor guy, she thought, the road's so empty here, he could be waiting until morning. She pulled the bus over and walked up to him. "Hello, is everything all right? Do you need any help?" she asked with a warm smile. The stranger, a tall man with dark, slightly curly hair and striking eyes, looked up at her with a bewildered expression. "Good evening," he mumbled. "I'm not really sure what to do. It's completely broken down." "Don't worry," Michelle smiled. "I'm a bus driver, maybe I can help." The man raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Wait, do you actually know how to fix cars?" "Well, I won't know until I try," Michelle replied, peering under the hood. "How long has it been broken?" "A couple of hours," he sighed. "I've been waiting forever for help, and to top it off, my phone's dead." What happened next was nothing short of a miracle, the kind that can only occur when someone truly loves what they do. Michelle quickly surveyed the engine, identified the issue, and skillfully fixed it using tools she had in her bag. "There we go," she said, standing up and brushing off her hands. "Now you can be on your way." "You're incredible." The man was astonished. "I don't even know how to thank you." "Oh, don't be silly." Michelle waved him off. "I'm just glad I could help." "No, really, I can't just leave it at that," the stranger insisted. "How about letting me buy you a cup of coffee as a thank you?" Michelle hesitated. She usually didn't engage in casual encounters, but there was something captivating about this man, something in his eyes that drew her in. "All right," she agreed. "I'd like that." After that, they began meeting regularly. The man, whose name was Sean, was attentive, caring, and romantic. He won Michelle over with his sincerity and boundless tenderness. It wasn't long before they were married, driven by their love and passion. Sean used to say I was the sunshine that lit up his life, Michelle thought, lying in bed, a hint of sadness in her sigh. He promised he'd love me forever, take care of me and our future children. A bitter smile touched her lips. The eternity Sean had painted turned out to be much shorter than he'd promised. But life went on, and she knew she had to keep moving forward. We'll get through it, she reassured herself, trying once more to drift off to sleep. Exhausted from the day, Michelle closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept circling back to the trial, Sean's betrayal, his mistress, and the strange wanderer now sheltered under her roof. But most of all, she worried about her mother. This was the third time Michelle had heard her mother's labored sigh from the other room. I hope she feels better after the injection, Michelle whispered, getting up from bed. The room was dark, with only a faint sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtain. Virginia, wrapped in a warm blanket, was tossing and turning restlessly. "Mama, how are you feeling?" Michelle asked softly, leaning over her bed. "My head is spinning," Virginia whispered, grasping Michelle's hand. "The medicine isn't helping at all." "Hold on, Mom, I'll give you the shot," Michelle said soothingly, retrieving the syringe with the prescribed medication from the nightstand. She carefully administered the medicine, gently stroking her mother's hand. Virginia closed her eyes, sighed, and relaxed. "Michelle, could you read to me a little?" she whispered, not yet fully drifting off to sleep. Michelle smiled. Her mother's request took her back to her childhood, when she, a little girl, would fall asleep to her mother's bedtime stories. "Sure," Michelle replied, picking up a book from the nightstand. She began to read aloud, trying to choose a calm, soothing tone. Her voice, like a soft whisper, filled her mother's soul with warmth and care. Virginia, listening to her daughter, slowly drifted off to sleep. Overall, she was restless. Michelle got up several times to give her mother more medicine and help her sleep. Each time, she checked her temperature, reassured her, and promised that everything would be fine. "Mom, sleep," Michelle whispered, seeing her mother breathing steadily. "Michelle," Virginia whispered in a half-sleep, "you're such a wonderful daughter. I'm so glad I have you." "And you, Mom, are the best in the world," Michelle replied, pressing her cheek against her hand. The morning greeted them with a fresh, slightly cool draft coming through the half-open window. Michelle smiled and got out of bed. Half an hour later, a pot of oatmeal sat on the kitchen table, the aroma blending with the smell of fresh coffee for Michelle and Billy, and sweet tea for the children. Arthur, David, and Ralph eagerly dug into their breakfast, interrupting each other with stories about how Uncle Billy taught them to draw funny faces. Billy, sitting across from them, smiled as he watched. He felt awkward but, at the same time, cozy in this noisy, love-filled family. "Mom, aren't you going to eat?" David asked, gently pushing a plate toward her. "Thanks, sweetheart," she replied, patting his head. "I'm just not hungry yet." At that moment, the phone rang. Michelle picked it up and stepped aside. Her face immediately darkened. "Yes, it's me. I understand. No, I really get it. Thank you." She hung up the phone, slowly sitting down at the table. Her shoulders slumped, and her eyes filled with tears, which she fought to hold back. "Is something wrong, Mom?" Arthur asked, his voice full of concern. "It's okay, sweetie," Michelle replied, forcing a smile despite the tension. "I'm just a little tired." Billy, noticing her state, immediately tensed up. He knew right away that something was off with that phone call. "Michelle, is something wrong?" Billy asked, concern in his voice. "Nothing," she answered, her voice betraying her as it wavered, "just a lot has piled up lately." "You can tell me everything," Billy offered, giving her a meaningful look. "I really want to help." Michelle shook her head. Deep down, she really didn't want anyone to see her weakness. especially not the children. After all, she had always been their strong support, someone who would never betray them, someone who would give everything. "Don't worry," Michelle repeated, hoping her voice sounded confident. "Everything will be fine." After breakfast, she went to her room, telling everyone she needed to rest for a while. Only once she had closed the door did Michelle finally allow herself to cry. The tears flowed down her cheeks, burning her skin. The phone call from the medical center, which she had tried so hard to push out of her mind, resurfaced in her thoughts. The quota for her mother's surgery had been rejected. Suddenly, the door creaked open quietly. Standing in the doorway was a sheepish Billy. "Michelle," he began, "I heard you crying. Can you tell me what happened?" At that moment, she could no longer hold back her sobs. It felt as though a dam had burst inside her. All her fears, pain, and hopelessness from the past months came rushing out. She told him about the call from the clinic, how her hopes had shattered, and how hard it was to witness and hear her mother's daily suffering. "I'm so sorry," Billy whispered, sitting down beside her. "I don't know what to say, but I'm ready to be here for you and your kids." Michelle buried her face in his shoulder and cried like a little girl. Billy embraced her, and the warmth of his heart soothed them both. "Mom can't know about this," Michelle sobbed, pulling away slightly. "She's already suffering enough." "I understand," Billy nodded, "but remember, you are not alone. You have your children who need your strength. I'll be here if you need help." Michelle looked into his kind, understanding eyes and forced a weary smile. For the first time in a long while, she felt like there was someone there, ready to support her in a tough moment. Billy hesitated for a moment, then decided to be open with her, pulling a small key out of his jeans pocket. "This was given to me by the notary," he whispered, as if afraid of being overheard. "He said that my inheritance is in the safe deposit box." Michelle raised her eyebrows in surprise. "An inheritance?" "Yes," Billy nodded, "but as soon as I left the office, they attacked me, shoved me into a car, and drove me out to the river." "Attacked you?" Michelle flinched. Billy sat down and clenched the key tightly in his hand. "Yes, that's right. They wanted to get rid of me, to throw me into the river. But I managed to survive and keep this." "Oh my God, who were they?" Billy shook his head in despair. "I don't know. Just strangers, people I didn't recognize." "But why?" Michelle asked, her face showing concern. "What kind of inheritance is this that would make them attack you?" Billy sighed, and his face darkened. "If only I knew. First, I need to tell you something, Michelle. I used to be an orderly at the city hospital." "Wow, really?" She looked at him with a mix of interest and apprehension. Billy nodded. "I loved my job, I helped people, but the head of the department, Eric Johnson, was greedy and selfish. He started demanding money from the patients for the help I was giving them. My grandmother taught me how to do massages, how to find the right pressure points on the body. I never charged anyone for it. But the head of the department decided to make money off my abilities. I refused. I told him it was wrong." "And then what happened?" Michelle asked, unable to hide her worry as she watched him. "Eric framed me. He convinced the medical staff and some patients to give false testimony. Of course, he dictated everything to them," Billy said, clenching his hands. "He claimed I extorted money from the patients. The bribery case was investigated at a fast pace. I ended up behind bars." "But you weren't guilty," Michelle protested, gently touching his hand. "No, of course, I wasn't guilty." Michelle listened, and her heart ached for him. "And the inheritance? Where did it come from?" she asked, trying to understand how all of this was connected. "The notary said it was from one of the patients," Billy replied. "All 4 years I spent in prison, his will was waiting for me. I never remembered the name of the patient. It turns out he was a big businessman. I suspect that Eric might be behind the attack on me. After all, he couldn't have been unaware of the inheritance. That's just unbelievable." Michelle exclaimed, shaken by the story. "I'm so sorry you had to go through all that." "Thank you," Billy whispered. "You're the only person I can tell all this to. When I got out, I was straight on the street. My wife, while I was serving time, got a divorce and sold the apartment. Of course, I didn't get a penny. I still had an investigation going on, and Wilma had already found herself a lover so she wouldn't have to spend her days alone. No one will hire me. They say ex-cons are worth nothing. That's the way things are." Michelle nodded and quietly added, "All right, Billy, stay with me for now. Mom doesn't mind. And the boys like you. As for your inheritance, don't rush to deal with it yet, let everything settle. I really need to get to work, though. Sorry, it's going to be a tough day ahead." "All right, good luck to you. I'll be waiting for you tonight with the kids, and, of course, with your mom," Billy muttered, feeling a little embarrassed. A sweet smile appeared on Michelle's lips. It really was nice that she helped him last night. He turned out to be a good guy after all. The road to the bus depot took Michelle no more than 10 minutes. The morning air was cool, pleasantly refreshing after almost an entire sleepless night. Her bus, her faithful friend and companion, was already waiting at the stand. Michelle habitually checked the instruments, started the engine, and the familiar hum of the motor filled the space. "Oh, Michelle, hello," came Jeffrey's cheerful voice, the controller who greeted her bus. "We've got an inspection today, so be careful. They say there's a new owner, and he's strict." "Another inspection?" Michelle sighed, adjusting her uniform jacket absent-mindedly. "Yeah, something like that. They say it's a big businessman who bought the entire fleet. He'll be checking how we work," Jeffrey winked. "Don't let us down, Michelle. You're our best." Michelle smiled back but felt a tightening in her chest from anxiety. Another inspection. It seemed like the last few years of her life had been one big test of endurance, testing her strength, her motherly love, her humanity. She checked everything once again, the brake system, mirrors, windshield wipers, the first aid kit, following all the required rules. Her bus was always in order, something that had been repeatedly noted in her personnel file. The doors of the bus hissed open, letting in the cool morning air. From the crowd of passengers scrambling to take their seats, an elderly man immediately stood out. He wore a worn but clean coat, and his gray beard and sparse hair gave him the appearance of a lost old forest dweller. Michelle quickly scanned the bus interior in the rearview mirror and smoothly started the engine. "Citizens, don't forget to pay for your ride. The controller is on board," Jeffrey's loud voice announced. The passengers immediately started chatting, jingling coins as they paid for their tickets according to the established fare. But the old man in the coat had a slight delay. "Good sir, I can't find my wallet," he muttered, addressing Jeffrey. "What's wrong with you, old man, so careless?" Jeffrey barked. "No money, get off the bus. No need to hang around here and pull at the heartstrings." "Yeah, go on, you're just in the way." Tears sparkled in the old man's eyes. Squinting, he began searching for his elusive wallet under the seats of the passengers. This drove the controller absolutely mad. "Please, Jeffrey," Michelle intervened, her voice sounding tired, "give the man a chance to sort it out. Maybe he really lost his money?" "Oh, now we have a defender," Jeffrey started to argue, but Michelle shot him a stern look, quickly silencing him. "Jeffrey, no, please. You know we're not allowed to throw people off the bus unless it's at a stop." Jeffrey snorted in annoyance but grudgingly moved away. The old man, head down, slumped into his seat. "Better check once more," Michelle added, carefully scanning the bus interior. "Maybe something really fell to the floor." Jeffrey, realizing that arguing with the driver was pointless, muttered to himself and began checking the tickets along the aisle. The old man, gripping the handrails and trying to keep his balance, mumbled, "Thank you for your kindness." Michelle smiled, already used to the gratitude of random passengers, their cheerful and sorrowful stories, and the sense of mutual support that warmed her soul during her shifts. Suddenly, the old man, as if remembering something, grabbed his head and tugged at a messy strand of hair. In that instant, his wig slipped off, and his silvery hair cascaded down his shoulders like a silver fountain. "Kevin Beck?" Jeffrey, standing behind him, couldn't believe his eyes. "Is it really you?" "Yes, it is indeed," the businessman nodded. "I'm Kevin, the new owner of your bus fleet. I suppose you didn't expect to see me like this?" "Well, I decided to check how things were going in my domain. And, it seems, not too well. The kind of rudeness shown to passengers, even if they look like homeless people, is absolutely unacceptable. But at the same time, I was pleasantly surprised by the kindness of the only female driver in my fleet. Bravo, Michelle. I'm pleased to inform you that I'll personally make sure you receive a bonus." Jeffrey turned pale. Meanwhile, Michelle, not hiding her joy, smiled. It seemed the inspection was not going the way the controller had expected. But for Michelle, it was an unexpected opportunity, an opportunity to prove that she was not only an experienced driver but also a caring and fair employee. At that very moment, Billy, in her apartment, slipped on an old t-shirt and looked around. His eyes immediately noticed what Michelle, in her rush and the concerns of the past days and months, had neglected to see: the old furniture, worn and falling apart, tables with chipped corners, chairs with loose legs. "Well, this is just unacceptable," Billy muttered to himself as he approached the wobbly table and easily screwed the loose leg back in place. Virginia, opening her eyes slightly, immediately noticed his actions. "Billy, what are you doing?" she whispered in a weak voice. "Fixing things, Virginia," he smiled warmly at her. She smiled back, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I've been alone for so many years, ever since Michelle lived with her husband," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "Well, you're not alone now," Billy replied, continuing his work. Moving quietly around the apartment, he fixed the handle that had fallen off the cabinet and tightened the wobbly shelf in the kitchen. His movements were smooth and confident. In a good way, Billy felt at home here. Suddenly, loud music started playing from somewhere upstairs. Billy flinched but quickly regained his composure. After thinking for a moment, he went out into the hallway and climbed a floor higher. A minute later, the music stopped. "I hope they understand," Billy said, returning to Virginia. "You're a miracle," she whispered, smiling. "Those neighbors of mine were trying to drive me crazy with that music. Every day, they blast it. But I need rest, I'm sick." "I understand," Billy replied with a smile. "I don't like disorder either, and I can't stand when someone is treated badly or when the weak are hurt." With that, he went back to his work. Billy's hands knew how to create, despite the many years he had spent behind barbed wire. He changed light bulbs, hammered nails, fixed chairs, and did everything that required a strong, capable man's hand. And he did all of it not just to impress Michelle, although that mattered too. He did it simply to help the woman who had taken him in. He felt needed again, and right now, that was the most important thing for him. When Michelle returned home from work, she was surprised to see that the house had changed for the better. It had been a difficult day for her, and it had taken a lot of effort to persuade Kevin not to fire Jeffrey. In the end, the businessman agreed with her and gave the offending controller another chance. He also equipped each bus with a small camera to personally monitor the travel times on all routes simultaneously. As a special gesture of gratitude, Kevin gave Michelle a day off to rest and regain her strength. Michelle decided to make good use of the day and go with Billy to the storage locker. A beam of sunlight broke through the thick curtains and landed on her face, waking Michelle from a restless sleep. Yesterday's day, filled with worries and surprises, seemed to imprint itself on her mind like a vivid scene from a movie. Billy, his story, the key found in rags, and the sense of something important hidden in the locker. Michelle had decided that she would finally get some rest on her day off, but the thought of her guest and his fate wouldn't let her rest. She quickly prepared breakfast, and after ensuring that the children made it to school safely and called her, she went outside, where Billy was already waiting for her. He looked nothing like he had during their meeting by the riverbank. neat, and clean clothes that Michelle had picked out for him from Sean's belongings, he radiated calm and confidence. They walked down the street, each lost in their own thoughts. Michelle was pondering how Billy's fate would unfold once he found out what was in the locker. Billy, on the other hand, was probably wondering whether there would be anything valuable inside. His voice carried a mix of hope and apprehension. The bank they were heading to was an old building with high ceilings and a marble staircase. Inside, there was an air of luxury and grandeur. The smell of fine leather and coffee filled the air, while the only sound was the quiet rustling of papers and the steady ticking of the clock. Johnny Watts, the bank clerk who was meeting them in his office, was a middle-aged man with neatly combed back hair and a somewhat nervous glance. He looked at Billy with a hint of disdain, as though a wanderer had wandered into a holy sanctum. "So, you want to open the storage locker?" "Well, of course, but the procedure is a bit complicated," the banker began, with an exaggerated politeness. At that moment, Michelle felt as if he was stalling on purpose. Her intuition told her that something was off here. "What exactly is complicated about it?" she asked, trying to keep calm. "We have the key the notary gave us. Everything should go smoothly." "Yes, of course, you're right," Johnny mumbled. "But we still need to verify the inheritance documents, confirm their authenticity." He spoke slowly, as though carefully choosing his words. Billy, nervous, clutched the key tightly in his hands. Michelle felt her patience beginning to snap. "Are you kidding me?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Because of you, we're wasting time here, and we already have so much to do." Johnny flinched. "No, of course not, everything's fine. It's just standard bank formalities, we have to follow the procedure." Michelle gave a restrained nod, signaling that she would see it through to the end. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of delays, the banker relented and went to open the locker. Billy held his breath as he watched the bank clerk retrieve a small velvet box. As he opened it, he froze, stunned by what he saw. Inside, there were jewels, necklaces, rings, brooches, glittering in every color of the rainbow. Michelle, staring at the sparkling gemstones, was in shock. This was practically a treasure trove. And all of it now belonged to Billy. "Is this all mine?" he whispered, unable to believe his eyes. "Yes," Johnny choked out. "Everything in the locker, according to the will, now belongs to you." Billy and Michelle exchanged a glance. In their eyes, there was not only surprise but also the realization that life was about to change. Stepping outside, Billy called a taxi, saying it would be safer that way. As they were nearing Michelle's house, he promised to help with the money for his mother's surgery. At first, Michelle firmly refused, but remembering the groans her mother made at night, she realized it would be best to accept the offer from this new acquaintance. However, before exchanging any of the jewels for money, Michelle persuaded Billy to contact a private investigator to find out who attacked him when he left the notary's office. Billy agreed and followed her suggestion. A month passed quickly. The air in the hospital room was filled with the scent of medicine, mixed with the faint fragrance of flowers that Michelle had placed in a modest vase. Virginia was lying on the bed, covered by a warm blanket. On her face, usually full of wrinkles from worries and time, there was a look of relief after the surgery. Next to the bed, a chair was positioned where Michelle sat, anxiously watching her mother. On her face, usually radiating inexhaustible optimism and cheerfulness, there were signs of concern, and in her eyes, hope had frozen. Arthur, David, and Ralph, like little angels, were shifting from one foot to another, glancing at their grandmother's face now and then. The room was filled with an atmosphere of tenderness and tranquility, interrupted only by the soft rustling of bed linens and Virginia's occasional light cough. Billy, observing the scene, felt an inexplicable warmth inside. He had never seen such sincere and deep love as Michelle surrounded her mother with. Suddenly, the door to the room opened. A tall, stately man in his 50s, with a perceptive gaze and pleasant features, entered. This was George Jenkins, the private detective. After Michelle introduced him to the family, she immediately got to the point. We want to find out who attacked Billy, and we're very grateful for any help you can provide." The detective nodded, paused briefly, then spoke. "I conducted an investigation at your request, and as you can see, I'm here. Unfortunately, my initial suspicions have been confirmed. The attack was organized by the former head of the department where Billy worked as an orderly, Eric Johnson. Ironically, he turned out to be the biological father of Sean, your ex-husband. Together, father and son decided to get rich by claiming Billy's inheritance, which he had received as a reward from a lonely and wealthy patient. By the way, the patient was a distant relative of Kevin Beck. Money attracts money, as they say." In the room, there was a moment of heavy silence. Michelle and Billy were in shock, the children exchanged fearful glances, and Virginia opened her eyes slightly, looking worriedly at her daughter. "But how did they do it?" Michelle asked, still unable to believe her ears. George replied, "It's quite simple. They followed Billy after his visit to the notary. They waited for the right moment, attacked him, and intended to throw him into the river. But fortunately, Billy managed to survive and keep the key. Eric and Sean thought Billy was dead, but they had no idea he survived." "And how did you find them?" Billy asked, surprised. "Street surveillance cameras. They recorded all the movements of the criminals. I managed to trace their route and identify their identities. All the individuals involved in the case have already been arrested. Believe me, they're facing some serious sentences. Oh, Michelle, I almost forgot. Your husband's mistress, Judy, is also under investigation. She worked as a secretary for the notary, and it's very possible the leak came from her." Michelle clenched her fists painfully, as if waking from a bad dream. She understood that Sean and his father were willing to do anything to seize someone else's wealth, something that had enticed them for years while Billy was in prison due to a false accusation. Later, when the tension had settled, Billy stepped out of the room, holding Michelle's hand, and whispered something sweet and intimate into her ear. She blushed, and Ralph, standing nearby, grinned and said, "Mom, say yes, we need a dad like that." Suddenly, Billy held out a small velvet-covered box. Michelle opened it and gasped in amazement. Inside was a ring with a tiny diamond, its sparkle driving away all the clouds over her family. "I agree," Michelle whispered, sealing her words with a kiss. Ralph, Arthur, and David all clapped enthusiastically. Their joyful laughter echoed in Virginia's ears as she was recovering. If you enjoyed the story, please support it with a like and a comment. All the best to you.